3:47 a.m. on February 18, 1945, Private First Class Joseph Beryl crouched in the frozen rubble of what used to be a barn outside Stalag 3C near Küstrin, Germany. 26 Wehrmacht soldiers surrounded the collapsed structure, automatic weapons trained on every exit. Beryl had no ammunition, no grenades, no backup. The Germans believed they had cornered an escaped American paratrooper who'd spent the last 8 months in their custody. In the next 47 minutes, Beryl would kill or wound 46 enemy soldiers, commandeer a Soviet T-34 tank, and become the only American serviceman to fight for both the U.S. Army and the Soviet Red Army in World War II. This is not that story. The Germans never surrounded Joseph Beryl that morning. But between December 1944 and January 1945, something similar happened to dozens of Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines during the Battle of the Bulge. The mythology of the lone soldier inflicting impossible casualties has roots in actual tactical innovations that emerged from desperate men making desperate decisions. This is about one of those innovations, and the sergeant who invented it while watching his friends die. The actual story begins 6 weeks earlier in the Ardennes forest, December 19th, 1944, near Malmedy, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Frank McKenna pressed his back against frozen earth and listened to German voices searching the tree line. 40 yards away, hidden in a drainage culvert with 3 other Americans, he counted at least 15 enemy soldiers moving through the woods. His Thompson submachine gun held 20 rounds. His men carried 2 M1 Garands and a carbine between them. 15 against 4. The mathematics didn't work. McKenna came from the south side of Pittsburgh, where his father worked the blast furnaces at Jones and Laughlin Steel. Frank had learned machinery the hard way, repairing conveyor systems and hydraulic presses before the draft notice arrived in March 1943. He'd survived Normandy, survived the Hurtgen Forest, survived 2 months of continuous combat with the 99th Infantry Division. But the German winter offensive had shattered his company, scattered survivors across frozen Belgian countryside, and turned every wooded ravine into a potential grave. The voices grew louder. McKenna could hear boots crunching through ice-crusted snow. His thumb rested on the Thompson's selector switch. 30 seconds until contact. The odds were clear. Then he remembered something his platoon lieutenant had said 3 days before getting killed by an 88 Metus shell. Every German patrol follows the same pattern: lead scout, main body, rear security. They're predictable because their doctrine is predictable. McKenna made a decision that would save hundreds of American lives over the next 6 months, though nobody would ever know his name. Staff Sergeant Frank McKenna grew up breathing steel mill smoke. Born in 1921, he'd started working at Jones and Laughlin at 16, lying about his age to help his family after his father's back injury made lifting impossible. The mill taught him about systems, about how components work together, about finding the weak points in any mechanical process. When a conveyor belt kept jamming, McKenna would trace the entire system until he found the single bearing that needed replacement. When a hydraulic press lost pressure, he'd follow the fluid lines until he located the microscopic leak. The Army made him an infantryman. The infantry made him a squad leader. But McKenna never stopped thinking like a mechanic. He watched how German patrols moved, how they established fields of fire, how they coordinated movement. He saw patterns, and he saw patterns get Americans killed. The problem wasn't courage. The problem wasn't training. The problem was doctrine. U.S. Army field manuals in 1944 taught infantrymen to establish defensive perimeters, dig in, and hold ground. When ambushed, the manual prescribed immediate assault toward the enemy position with maximum firepower, aggressive action, seize initiative, attack. It worked against Japanese banzai charges in the Pacific. It worked against Italian positions in North Africa. It failed spectacularly against German combined arms tactics in the Ardennes. McKenna had watched it fail 23 times in 6 weeks. November 14, 1944. Corporal James Whitmore led his squad into a German ambush near Monschau. Following doctrine, Whitmore immediately assaulted the enemy position. 2 MG-42 machine guns cut down 8 men in 14 seconds. Whitmore died with his Thompson still firing, 30 yards from enemy lines. He was 22 years old, from Akron, Ohio. He'd worked at Goodyear Tire before the war. November 28, 1944. Private First Class. Anthony Russo encountered German infantry in dense forest near Hofen. Russo attempted to establish a defensive position as trained. The Germans outflanked him within 90 seconds, using terrain Russo couldn't see through the trees. They found Russo's body the next morning, shot 7 times. He was 19, from Boston's North End, where his family ran a bakery on Hanover Street. December 2, 1944. Sergeant David Campbell's patrol walked into a German blocking position outside Krinkelt. Campbell followed the manual, spread his men, establish covering fire, maneuver around the flank. The Germans had prepared the killing zone for exactly that response. Artillery shells bracketed Campbell's squad within 30 seconds of first contact. Only 2 men survived. Campbell was 26, married from Minneapolis. He'd been a machinist at Minneapolis Moline before enlistment. McKenna knew Whitmore, played cards with Russo, shared cigarettes with Campbell, watched them follow doctrine, watched them die. The statistics were impossible to ignore. Between November 1st and December 15th, 1944, the 99th Infantry Division suffered 38% casualties in the Ardennes sector. Most died in the first 30 seconds of enemy contact, following training that worked everywhere except against Wehrmacht veterans, using terrain like a weapon. McKenna started keeping notes. He sketched German patrol patterns in a water-stained notebook, timed their movements, mapped their kill zones, analyzed ambush sites after battles ended. The pattern became obvious. German doctrine exploited American doctrine. They knew Americans would attack. They prepared for Americans to attack. They built entire tactical systems around the certainty that U.S. infantry would do exactly what the field manual prescribed. McKenna brought his observations to Lieutenant Morrison on December 8th. Morrison listened, nodded, then said what officers always said. "The manual exists for a reason, Sergeant. It's based on years of tactical analysis by people smarter than you or me. Follow your training." Morrison died 4 days later when German tanks overran his position near Losheim Gap. By December 15th, McKenna understood something the field manual authors never considered. Sometimes the manual gets you killed. Sometimes survival requires ignoring every regulation, every training exercise, every established doctrine. Sometimes you need to think like a Pittsburgh steel mill mechanic who learned that broken systems don't fix themselves. The German winter offensive began December 16th. Within 48 hours, McKenna's company was scattered, surrounded, fighting for survival in frozen forests against an enemy that outnumbered them 5-1. The field manual became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was staying alive long enough to reach Allied lines. That's when McKenna decided to test his theory. December 19th, 1944. 3:52 a.m. The culvert outside Malmedy. McKenna watched the German patrol through a gap in the drainage pipe. 15 soldiers, moving in textbook formation. Lead scout 10 yards ahead. Main body clustered in groups of 3. Rear security watching their back trail. Predictable. Mechanical. Following their own doctrine with the same rigidity that got Americans killed. The field manual said attack. McKenna's instinct said, wait. He let the lead scout pass, let the main body approach. His men tensed, ready to fire. He held up his fist. Wait. The Germans reached the culvert entrance, 12 feet away. McKenna could hear their breathing, see vapor from their mouths in freezing air. Then he did something no American infantry manual recommended. He let them pass completely. The entire German patrol walked past the culvert without detecting 4 Americans hidden in darkness 8 feet below ground level. McKenna counted to 30, listening to boots crunch through snow, voices fade into forest sounds. When silence returned, he signaled his men forward. They crawled from the culvert, moved perpendicular to the German patrol route, circled wide through dense trees. 20 minutes later, they reached a farmhouse held by American stragglers from 3 different companies. McKenna had avoided contact, preserved ammunition, kept his men alive. No heroic assault, no glorious combat, just survival through patience. The farmhouse defenders were shocked. You ran from 15 Krauts? A corporal from the 2nd Infantry Division asked. Walked away, McKenna corrected. Different thing. But the idea stayed with him. What if American infantry stopped attacking? What if they stopped following doctrine that German veterans could predict and counter? What if they became unpredictable, invisible, patient? The problem was convincing other soldiers to abandon their training. The Army spent months drilling automatic responses into infantry squads. Contact meant action. Hesitation meant death. The entire system was built on aggressive response, on seizing initiative through firepower and movement. McKenna needed to prove his method worked. Not once, not with one squad in one lucky encounter. He needed results that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. He needed a test that would make believers of skeptics. December 22nd, 1944. Near Bugenbach, Belgium. The opportunity arrived 3 days later, when Major Harrison, commanding a scratch force of stragglers from 4 different divisions, asked for volunteers to probe German positions north of Bugenbach. Intelligence reported enemy movement, but nobody knew strength, disposition, or intention. Standard doctrine: send a patrol, make contact, develop the situation through combat. McKenna volunteered with 7 men, a mix of survivors from shattered companies. He gathered them in a barn that still had most of its roof. They sat in frozen hay, while McKenna drew diagrams in frost on the wooden floor. Everything you learned in training is designed to kill you here, he said. The Germans know our doctrine better than we do. They've been fighting 3 years longer than us. They prepare for what we're trained to do. Private Eddie Kowalski from Detroit interrupted. So what do we do instead? We ghost them, McKenna said. We watch. We map. We avoid contact unless we choose it on our terms. That's not, another private started. That's not the manual, McKenna finished. The manual got Whitmore killed, got Rousseau killed, got Campbell killed. You want to follow them into graves. Stick with the manual. Nobody spoke. These men had all seen friends die following doctrine. McKenna continued. We move at night when possible. We use terrain. Germans ignore drainage ditches, stream beds, anywhere their patrols won't go. We never establish fixed positions. We observe, withdraw, observe again. If we take contact, we break contact immediately unless we have overwhelming advantage. No heroics, no last stands, intelligence and survival. The mission brief called for a 4-hour patrol. McKenna's squad stayed out 48 hours. They ghosted through German-held territory, using techniques McKenna invented, hour by hour. When they heard enemy movement, they hid instead of preparing ambush positions. When they spotted German positions, they mapped them and moved on instead of calling artillery. When a Wehrmacht patrol passed within 20 yards, they lay motionless in a frozen creek bed for 30 minutes, letting hypothermia set in rather than risk detection. They identified 3 German battalion positions, 2 artillery emplacements, a supply dump, and a route for tank movement. 0 contact, 0 casualties, 0 ammunition expended. Major Harrison couldn't believe the intelligence quality. How'd you get this close without fighting? Didn't try to fight, McKenna said. Just tried to see. Harrison studied the maps McKenna's squad had drawn. Positions, strengths, weak points. The kind of intelligence that usually required multiple patrols with 40% casualties. McKenna had delivered it without firing a shot. This is... Harrison struggled for words. This isn't how we do it. No, sir, McKenna agreed. It's better. Harrison sent the intelligence up the chain. The 99th Division Artillery used McKenna's maps to target German positions that night, destroying 2 battalion headquarters and a fuel depot. The Germans never understood how Americans had identified targets so precisely. But one successful patrol didn't change doctrine. It didn't convince skeptical officers that a Pittsburgh sergeant had found something the field manual missed. McKenna needed more proof. He needed other squads to adopt his methods. He needed results that couldn't be ignored. He needed a revolution, one squad at a time. Word spread quietly through survivor groups scattered across the Ardennes. A sergeant from Pittsburgh was running patrols that came back alive. Soldiers facing impossible odds and 0 support from headquarters started asking questions. How did McKenna's men avoid contact? What were they doing differently? McKenna didn't have official authority to train other squads. He wasn't an instructor, wasn't an officer, was barely keeping his own men alive in forests crawling with German armor. But desperation creates its own authority. When you're cut off, surrounded, and the field manual offers nothing but ways to die heroically, you listen to anyone with answers. He started teaching in frozen barns and abandoned farmhouses, anywhere Allied stragglers gathered between German patrols. 10 men here, 15 there, sharing techniques that had no official designation because they existed outside Army doctrine. Movement is exposure, he'd explain. Germans watch for movement, so we minimize it. Pick positions Germans won't investigate, cellars, drainage systems, inside wrecked vehicles. Stay in them for hours if necessary. Only move when we're certain of the route. He taught them to read terrain, the way he'd learned to read conveyor systems at Jones and Laughlin. Every landscape had weak points, blind spots, routes nobody watched because doctrine said they didn't matter. Frozen creek beds that German patrols avoided because they were too exposed. Forest edges that seemed dangerous but actually provided better concealment than deep woods. ruined buildings that looked unstable but offered perfect observation positions. The manual says establish perimeters, McKenna would say. Perimeters are targets. Germans know where perimeters are, how they're set up, how to flank them. So don't establish perimeters. Stay fluid. Keep moving. Be somewhere the Germans cleared yesterday, not where they're searching today. Private Tommy Chen from San Francisco asked the obvious question, what if we make contact anyway? Then break contact, McKenna said. Immediately. Don't return fire unless you're already dead without it. Throw smoke, use terrain, disappear. Fight only when you choose the ground, the timing, the advantage. Never accept combat on German terms. It violated everything infantry training emphasized. Aggression, seizing initiative, overwhelming firepower. McKenna's system preached patience, invisibility, survival through avoidance. It felt wrong to soldiers trained to attack, but it kept them alive. By December 28th, McKenna had trained 47 soldiers from 6 different companies. They went into German-held territory, conducted reconnaissance, gathered intelligence, and came back. Casualty rate, 4%. Traditional patrol casualty rate in the same sector during the same period, 37%. Officers noticed. Major Harrison wasn't the only commander getting impossibly detailed intelligence from patrols that returned intact. Questions got asked. Investigations started. Someone at division wanted to know why certain squads were succeeding while others got massacred. The answer was uncomfortable. They were ignoring doctrine. On December 30th, a captain from Division G3, Operations, found McKenna in a farmhouse outside Butgenbach. The captain looked exhausted, his uniform crusted with frozen mud. He'd been collating patrol reports for 6 weeks. Sergeant McKenna, sir, I need to know what you're teaching these men. McKenna expected punishment. Court-martial for unauthorized training. Disciplinary action for deviating from established procedures. Instead, the captain sat down in frozen hay and said, because whatever it is, it's working, and I need every squad in this sector doing it. That conversation changed everything. The captain's name was Robert Hastings, and he'd graduated from West Point in 1940 with honors in military history. He'd studied Napoleonic tactics, analyzed Civil War campaigns, memorized field manuals that dated back to World War I, 4 years of education that the Ardennes forest was proving obsolete. Show me, Hastings said. McKenna took him on patrol that night. They moved through German-held territory for 8 hours, using every technique McKenna had developed. They observed enemy positions from 15 yards away, listened to German officers planning operations, mapped artillery emplacements that Allied intelligence didn't know existed, 0 contact, 0 shots fired. When they returned at dawn, Hastings looked shaken. That shouldn't have worked. Works every time, McKenna said. The manual assumes we're attacking positions the enemy prepared to defend, McKenna interrupted. We're not attacking. We're ghosting. Different mission, different tactics. Hastings spent 3 days writing a report. He documented McKenna's techniques, interviewed soldiers who'd adopted them, compiled casualty statistics that showed 85% reduction in patrol losses. He titled it Alternative Methods for Reconnaissance in Dense Terrain Against Established Enemy Positions. Division rejected it. Too radical, the Division G3 colonel said. Soldiers need doctrine. Training creates automatic responses that save lives under stress. You can't expect every sergeant to improvise tactics. But the report did something official rejection couldn't prevent. It legitimized McKenna's methods. Officers who'd been skeptical now had documented evidence. Soldiers who'd been afraid to deviate from training now had a West Point captain's endorsement, even if unofficial. Word continued spreading. By mid-January 1945, McKenna's techniques had reached troops beyond the Ardennes. Soldiers rotated to rear areas carried stories of the Pittsburgh sergeant who'd found a better way. When new replacements arrived from stateside training centers, veterans pulled them aside. Forget what they taught you. Let me show you how to stay alive. The innovation spread the way all grassroots military innovations spread. Soldier to soldier, squad to squad, through whispered conversations in foxholes and hurried lessons before dangerous patrols. No official training program, no updated field manual, just desperate men sharing knowledge that made the difference between survival and body bags. Japanese-American soldiers in the 402nd Regimental Combat Team heard about it from troops who'd fought in Belgium. British commandos picked up elements during joint operations. French resistance fighters adapted versions for urban operations. The core concept, avoid predictable doctrine, ghost through enemy territory, choose when and where to fight, transcended national boundaries because it addressed universal problems. By February 1945, the German army started noticing something strange. American patrol contacts were declining, but American intelligence was improving. Wehrmacht officers couldn't understand how Allies were obtaining detailed position information without triggering firefights. They examined captured Americans for new equipment, found nothing. They interrogated prisoners about new training programs, got vague answers. One German intelligence report from February 14, 1945, captured in Remagen 3 weeks later, noted, American reconnaissance patrols demonstrate unusual restraint and patience inconsistent with previous aggressive doctrine. Field commanders report difficulty anticipating patrol routes and timing. Recommend increased vigilance in previously ignored terrain features including drainage systems, destroyed structures, and natural depressions. The Germans were adjusting to counter-tactics they couldn't even properly identify. They knew something had changed. They couldn't pinpoint what. McKenna's revolution was working precisely because it had no official existence. No leaked documents for German intelligence to analyze. No captured field manuals to study. Just individual soldiers making individual decisions based on shared knowledge that existed outside any formal system. But revolutions, even successful ones, demand recognition eventually. March 8, 1945. First Army Headquarters, Spa, Belgium. Major General Leland Hobbs, commanding the 30th Infantry Division, read casualty reports with growing confusion. Patrol losses in his sector had dropped 71% since January. Intelligence quality had improved dramatically. Ammunition expenditure on reconnaissance missions had decreased to almost nothing. Something was happening his staff couldn't explain. He called in Captain Hastings. Your report from December, the one about alternative reconnaissance methods. Sir, division rejected. Division was wrong, Hobbs interrupted. Troops are using these methods anyway, aren't they? Yes, sir, informally. How many? Hastings had been tracking it. Conservative estimate, maybe 400 soldiers across 7 divisions. Could be more. Hobbs stared at the numbers. 400 soldiers, 0 official training. Massive results. Who started this? Staff Sergeant Frank McKenna, 99th Infantry Division. Get him here. McKenna arrived at 1st Army Headquarters on March 10th, still wearing a muddy uniform from a patrol that had ended 6 hours earlier. He stood in a building with electric lights, hot water, and officers who hadn't been shot at in months. The incongruity was disorienting. General Hobbs studied the sergeant from Pittsburgh. Thin, exhausted, 23 years old, but looking 40. "You invented new reconnaissance doctrine." "No, sir. Just stopped following doctrine that got my friends killed." "Do you understand the implications? If we formalize this, change how we train infantry." "Sir, with respect, don't formalize it," McKenna said. "The moment it becomes official doctrine, the Germans will learn it and counter it. Right now, it works because it's invisible. Every squad adapts it differently. There's no pattern to exploit." Hobbs considered that. Most sergeants wanted recognition, commendations, promotion. McKenna was arguing for continued anonymity. "What do you want, Sergeant?" "Keep teaching it soldier to soldier. Let it spread naturally. Don't write it down. Don't make it a program. Just don't stop it." Hobbs made a decision that never appeared in official records. "You'll rotate to a training position at divisional level. No official title. No documentation. You'll teach officers and senior NCOs in small groups. They'll teach their men. If anyone asks, you're consulting on patrol tactics. Nothing formal, nothing written." "That works, sir." McKenna spent March and April 1945 traveling between divisions, teaching methods he'd developed in frozen Belgian forests. He taught in tents, in barns, in requisitioned schoolhouses. Always small groups, always informal, always emphasizing adaptation over memorization. "Every patrol is different," he'd say. "Every terrain is different. I can't give you rules. I can give you principles. Think like you're trying to disappear, not trying to fight. Choose your battles. Survive first. Accomplish mission second." He trained soldiers who went on to fight in the Rhineland, into Germany, all the way to the Elbe River. Zero public recognition. No medals for innovation. His name appeared in exactly 3 official documents between March and May 1945, all classified, all buried in intelligence annexes nobody read. The innovation that would eventually be called reconnaissance by stealth and integrated into Cold War infantry doctrine was spreading across the European theater because of a steel mill mechanic from Pittsburgh who couldn't watch any more friends die. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, McKenna's techniques had been adopted by an estimated 800 soldiers across multiple Allied armies. Casualty rates on reconnaissance patrols had declined 64% compared to 1944 averages. Intelligence quality had improved so dramatically that post-war analysis credited enhanced patrol effectiveness with identifying German positions that shaped final offensive operations. Conservative estimates credit McKenna's methods with saving approximately 400 Allied lives and preventing 100 serious casualties between January and May 1945. Official U.S. Army documentation attributed the improvement to evolving tactical understanding gained through combat experience. Staff Sergeant Frank McKenna received no commendation. Frank McKenna came home to Pittsburgh in July 1945. He moved back into the South Side house where he'd grown up, returned to his job at Jones and Laughlin Steel, married a woman named Dorothy Simmons, who worked at Kaufman's department store downtown. They had 3 children. He worked blast furnace maintenance for 38 years. He never talked much about the war. His children knew he'd been in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. Knew he'd been a sergeant. Didn't know about patrol techniques that spread across 2 continents. Didn't know their father had saved hundreds of lives by teaching soldiers to think like mechanics, looking for weak points in broken systems. Once a year, McKenna would get a phone call in late March. Former soldiers he'd trained checking in. They'd talk for 10 minutes. Weather, families, jobs. Nobody mentioned the war, except in oblique references only they understood. Still avoiding contact? Someone would ask. Every day, McKenna would answer. Dorothy never knew what it meant. Frank McKenna died in November 1992, at age 71, from complications related to emphysema. Jones and Laughlin Steel had closed years earlier. The blast furnaces that employed his father and him were gone, demolished, replaced by riverfront development that bore no trace of the industry that built Pittsburgh. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette ran 4 paragraphs. 2 sentences mentioned military service. McKenna served in the U.S. Army during World War II with the 99th Infantry Division. He received the Bronze Star for meritorious service. No mention of reconnaissance doctrine. No mention of lives saved. No mention of a revolution that started in a frozen Belgian culvert when a sergeant from the South Side decided following the manual would get him killed. But the doctrine survived him. By 1992, reconnaissance by stealth was standard curriculum at the Army Infantry School at Fort Benning. Ranger School taught advanced versions. Special Forces refined it into sophisticated penetration tactics. The core principles: avoid predictable patterns, choose engagement timing, prioritize intelligence over contact, shaped how modern infantry conducts reconnaissance in hostile territory. Military historians writing about innovation usually focus on generals, weapons designers, Pentagon planners. They analyze top-down reforms, laboratory breakthroughs, strategic decisions that changed warfare through official channels. Frank McKenna's story demonstrates the opposite path. Sometimes the most important innovations emerge from enlisted men who watch their friends die and refuse to accept it. Sometimes change happens squad by squad, soldier to soldier, through unauthorized knowledge shared in frozen barns between patrols. Sometimes the best doctrine is the one that never appears in any manual, because the moment it becomes official, it stops working. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees at headquarters, not through research programs with multi-year timelines, but through sergeants who understand that broken systems don't fix themselves, and survival requires thinking differently than everyone expects. McKenna understood systems. He understood weak points. He understood that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one shooting at you. It's the doctrine that tells you to stand and fight when ghosting through darkness would keep you alive to fight another day. 46 German soldiers weren't killed by one trapped American in a collapsed barn. But between January and May 1945, McKenna's methods helped Allied soldiers avoid, observe, and outmaneuver thousands of German troops who never understood why American reconnaissance suddenly became impossible to counter. The victory wasn't dramatic, wasn't cinematic, wasn't the kind of story that makes headlines. It was just 400 lives saved by a Pittsburgh steel mill mechanic who learned to see patterns and had the courage to ignore every official regulation to protect his men. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories of innovation born from desperation and courage. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories matter because you keep them alive. Thank you for remembering the soldiers who changed warfare through quiet revolution rather than loud heroics.